Oh, how much the world has changed in 6 years. It's back to Vienna for Iran nuclear negotiators, to the same venue where a UN-backed agreement was signed in 2015. Times have indeed changed, and more than once since Donald Trump walked away from the deal and tried his maximum pressure regime of increased sanctions. With Western allies forced to abide, Iran's not only retaliated by upping uranium enrichment, it's also looked for partners who can get around those transactions in US dollars. We'll ask about a recent trade deal with China and why it's perhaps not so popular among ordinary Iranians. And of course, we're going to be asking about these indirect talks that have started between Iran and the US. Can they quickly bear fruits? Iranians have elections in June, and Joe Biden's under pressure to demand more from an eventual new deal. Can they find common ground? Today in the France 24 debate, we're taking a look at those talks that got underway this Tuesday in Vienna. And with us from the Austrian capital, Bijan Kajapur, managing partner of business consultants Eurasian Nexus Partners. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you.
From Washington, D.C., former U.S. diplomat Ilan Goldenberg, director of the Middle East Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
She extensively covered for us the Iran nuclear deal back in 2015, back in the day. France 24's Sanam Chantier is with us. Sanam, I know in France, the tradition is you can say Happy New Year till the end of January. Can you say Happy Nowruz till mid-April?
Absolutely not. It's over as of Friday, I'm afraid.
Oh, dear. Okay. Too late. That ship sailed. All right. Well, thanks for joining us. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag F24debate. Yeah, the initial noises are positive ahead of the talks. U.S. Special Envoy Robert Malley suggesting the Biden administration could be open to lifting sanctions and returning to the 2015 deal, and the Iranians responding in kind.
این موضع رو ما واقع‌گرایانه ارزیابی می‌کنیم، امیدوار کننده ارزیابی می‌کنیم و این موضع می‌تواند آغازی برای اصلاح روند نادرستی باشه که دیپلماسی رو به بنبست رسونده بود. ما از این اظهارات استقبال می‌کنیم. فعلا نمی‌تونیم.
Sanam Chantier, it's all going very fast. Is peace breaking out?
Now, let's be clear about one thing. The very fact that we're all here now, once again, talking about these negotiations, I think that itself could be deemed somewhat of a breakthrough, Francois, certainly in comparison to several weeks ago. But these talks, and let's be careful and cautious about the language, they're about a mutual return to compliance by both parties, Tehran and Washington, unilateral gesture. So what are we talking about? Iran, once again, scaling back significant elements of its nuclear program in return for sanctions relief. And when I say those words, I feel like you and I are back on this set, me from Vienna, actually, and it's a sense of déjà vu because we're essentially going back to the sort of language that was used with the JCPOA. So steps are to be taken by both sides. And I think let's not be too optimistic. Let's take it one step at a time. It's going to be potentially a lengthy and arduous process.
But it's going fast. It's going faster than you thought?
Look, I mean, another meeting's happening on Friday. That's progress in itself. Araqchi, one of the top negotiators, saying that the talks were constructive earlier when he spoke. But look, I just want to be very cautious here. Slowly does it. Technical meetings, working groups. Also, we don't have the Iranians and the Americans, certainly not at this stage, meeting face-to-face.
At least not in front of the cameras.
Not for now. That's a red line by Iran's highest power, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And it will be the case until, apparently, sanctions are lifted. I think the big question, Francois, and let me just finish there and we can move on to the guests, is in terms of timing, is there a sense of urgency? I think probably most of us on the panel, I'm not sure about Ilan, but certainly Bijan and myself had previously constantly spoken about this sense of looming deadline when it comes to the Iranian elections in June. But that doesn't seem to be so relevant at the moment. According to Mali, who you mentioned earlier, the more important element is that the breakthrough time is certainly shrinking. Iran is enriching uranium at higher levels. And so the further that we go, and of course they've restricted the access of the nuclear inspectors, the further that we go and the more time there is between now and re-entry, the more catching up both sides will have to do.
Ilan Goldenberg, first of all, are you surprised at how fast things are going?
Well, I mean, I think this was something we were all hoping for, and actually I wish it would have happened sooner. I actually expect it to happen sooner, and would really be happy to also see, the U.S. and Iran engaging directly in all this. But absolutely, it's a positive step. We'll have to now wait and see what happens next. The devil will be in the details. When the U.S. and Iran have negotiated, at least when they negotiated the JCPOA, I mean, we're talking about months. This shouldn't be as long, but there are some tough issues. Questions about precisely which sanctions have to come off and when. There's also issues of research and development that Iran has conducted on its nuclear program since it started violating the agreement in response to the Trump administration walking away. Some of those things can't necessarily be undone. You can't unlearn something. And so the issues are not at all that simple. So I am cautiously optimistic. I'm certainly happier than I was, let's say, a week or two ago about how things are going. And I think we all should be more optimistic about that. But there's still a lot to go through. And there's also domestic politics, both in Iran with the upcoming election and in the United States with some of the challenges the Biden administration faces with opposition in Congress and domestic politics here.
Well,
so
let's break that down for a second, because there have been some who said, "Oh, because we're in a campaign season in Iran, there's no way they can come back to the table so soon." What do you make of that, Elon? The fact that they have come back?
So they have come back, which at least to me, at a minimum, indicates that they're feeling pressure from the international community to come back. I'm just not 100% sure yet if there is unity inside of Iran, amongst the leadership to come back into the agreement. And it obviously will also depend on what the Biden administration is willing to offer. And so, yes, I very much agree with other panelists that there is a significant benefit to getting this done before the Iranian elections for the United States, because you know who you're dealing with for the United States. You're dealing with Zarif and Arachi and the whole team around them who you negotiated the JCPOA with. You just don't know who you're going to necessarily get out the other side if you're waiting until after these elections for a new team to take office. So I would prefer to see progress before. But I think what the American administration has said, and I think it's a sensible position for the U.S. to have, is we'll negotiate with whoever is on the other side of the table, and we want to go back into the agreement. That seems to be a reasonable position, but I don't think we should fool ourselves into thinking that the U.S. would not prefer to get this done sooner rather than later.
All right, before I ask you about the obstacles or the challenges for Biden, let me turn to Bijan Kajapur on this. It's always remind our viewers here, where's the chain of command when it comes to nuclear negotiations? Does it rest with the president? Does it rest with the supreme leader? Is it a bit of both?
Well, it's a bit of both. One needs to understand the system in Iran as a system of councils. We have numerous councils that decide about strategic decisions. And in this specific case, the council that we need to focus on is the Supreme National Security Council, which is headed by the president, but has two very senior representatives from the supreme leader, one of which is actually the secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, Ali Shamkhani, a former defense minister, a former high-level military commander. But the chief nuclear negotiator over the past 7 years has been Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister. And I agree with Elon that the biggest advantage of trying to basically move on to the next level of talks or negotiations or interaction between Iran and the US is the fact that we have people on both sides, including Mr. Araghchi, who is in Vienna today, including Javad Zarif and others, who know each other very well, and they have interacted with each other. In a funny way, this would be the second birth of an agreement between these powers. The first one 6 years ago in Vienna, and if they manage to do the second one, it will be a big advantage for everyone. And that may explain why it's going relatively fast, because they know each other, they understand the dynamics, and you don't waste time on intercultural issues or distrust that would go very deep in people who don't know each other.
Yeah, Salam Chantier, when we had those nuclear negotiations that came to a head leading up to the 2015 deal, some people in the rest of the world had this misconception that Iran, after the revolution of '79, was this sort of reclusive state. And here, suddenly at the table, were these people speaking flawless English who'd been educated in either Britain or the U.S.
Absolutely. That's the case with Araghchi that Bijan Khajapour just mentioned. He was educated at Kent University. Obviously, Zarif is a fluent speaker of English. And I think looking beyond that, the fact that these men have lived abroad, they understand how to communicate with the international community beyond the regime in Iran, in the Islamic Republic. Looking at it, I think from the US perspective, Francois, it may actually make more sense to wait until after the Iranian election if they don't manage to overcome those massive stumbling blocks, just so that when it comes to the bigger bulk of the negotiations, certainly on the political level, they know they're dealing with a unified leadership. And I think that said, I think something that we need to remember, and we saw that at the negotiations that I was covering in Vienna, some of our colleagues were there, of course, is we have to remember Zarif had to go back to Iran at the peak of the talks to get the stamp of approval from none other than Iran's highest power, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. So as Bijan mentioned, lots of different councils dealing with this. But for me personally, the presidential election isn't sort of the only deadline that we need to work towards.
Right, and the deadlines, as Ilan Goldenberg was saying, work on both sides. Speaking to National Public Radio in the United States, the new U.S. Special Envoy to the talks, Robert Malley, was asked how he sees going beyond the confines of the current deal. And he said what we would pursue is, first of all, a longer agreement, because these are time limited, the one that was signed in 2015. It would be better, as in any arms control agreement, to see whether we could get a follow-on deal that extends the timeline. So that's his first objective, Ilan Goldenberg, to go beyond that JCPOA deal. And that's where Biden is perhaps feeling the pressure. There is a Trump effect in that for 4 years, we've heard in Washington critics saying that the deal that was signed is too narrow in scope. The pressure is going to be on Biden, isn't it, to make this a deal about much more than just uranium enrichment?
So look, Biden has talked about going for he calls it a longer and stronger deal. And longer really does apply to sunset provisions that expire. I mean, start expiring really the most important ones in 2026 and 2030. So there's time, if you go back into the agreement then, to start discussing some of these other issues. And then stronger, I think, really refers to U.S.-Iranian disagreements on other issues in the region, whether that's missiles, whether that's support for various proxy groups and destabilizing behavior. And both sides, I think, have strong complaints about the other.
But looking back on it, Ilan, do you agree that that 2015 deal was perhaps not ambitious enough?
No, I think that the 2015 deal was the best that you could do then. And the idea was, put the nuclear program as the most important, and we were heading towards crisis there. So put it back in a box and then try to build on it over time. And I do think that there's still an interest in building on it over time. And I think that doesn't just mean getting Iran to make more concessions. It's also going to require more concessions from the United States for more sanctions relief. It's also going to require negotiations between Iran and other regional players to de-escalate tensions in the region. Not all this is about sanctions. A lot of it is about regional security. And so I don't think there's an expectation that all of that has to happen right away. But there needs to be progress there in the years ahead after a return to the agreement. And if there isn't, it's not as though we're going to get to 2026 or 2030 and then all the sanctions are going to go away and all the sunset provisions are going to go away. No, in Washington, the reality of politics is everything will be reimposed. Eventually, you'll have a Republican president or you'll have objections from Democratic members of Congress. And so we're not going back. This has to be a first step. And so for Iran, the decision is, do we take this first step and buy ourselves a few years of sanctions relief or a few years of nuclear restraint and see if we can build on it? Or do we continue down sort of this escalatory ladder we're on right now? I think that's the decision for both sides, frankly.
Bijan Khajapour, on that score, what's the calculus in Tehran?
I think to understand what is happening in Tehran, we need to go back to what the calculus was in 2013 when these sort of the public negotiations started. Back then, Iran was looking for a sort of normalization of ties with the European Union. This is important to understand. Remember, there was a phase of sanctions where the Europeans were also part of the sanctions regime between 2010 and 2013. And in that phase, the Iranian calculus was to normalize ties with the European Union. They wanted to count on the European Union as the main source of capital and technology for Iran's development. But in those negotiations, I think it was 2014, Sanam will know exactly, but it was 2014 when the Iranian supreme leader said something very interesting. He said, this nuclear deal is a test for us. We are going to test to see basically the sincerity and earnest of the Western parties. And if this goes well, then we can start talking about other issues, including all the issues that Elon mentioned. This is important to understand. So what happened to that first test? Well, you can say all the Western parties failed. The United States withdrew from it. European states failed to really deliver on the technological and economic benefits that Iran was going to have. So now Iran is looking at the first test, realizing that maybe the other side is not able to deliver, and also realizing, which is very important, realizing that Europe and the United States will come as a package. You either enter into an agreement where you have both of them, or you have to just completely disregard the Western bloc and sort of turn towards the Eastern powers. But that also is not really feasible for Iran because they know Eastern powers will not give Iran the benefits that Iran expects without some sort of a relationship with Western powers. So it's a very difficult strategic equation. Iran wants the investment, Iran wants the technology, Iran wants the relationships, but it is difficult because there is a lack of confidence in Western states delivering on what they agree on.
Yeah, and this is something we're going to be talking about in part two, Sanam, which is does Iran look east or west at this point?
Absolutely. I have to just bounce off what Bijan was saying moments ago. The fact that up until this point, Tehran has seen that Washington hasn't been able to deliver, it has decided to find a different way, and this is something that we'll discuss in the second part of the program, a different way to send a loud and clear message to say we're not solely reliant on the US to go ahead with our agreements. And one of those bargaining chips comes in the shape of a so-called 25-year agreement between Tehran and Beijing. This allegiance, Françoise, you know, is by no means anything new. It's a decades-long relationship. It's not a breakthrough. But what it does, it's saying that Iran has other options. And just to add to those, you want to interrupt me? Go ahead.
I'm going to interrupt you last because we've taken a quick break. We're going to pick up on that point. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're speaking on the day when in Vienna, they held for the first time in years indirect talks between the United States and Iran, more scheduled for Friday. We're talking about it in the company of Bijan Kajapur is with us from the Austrian capital, managing partner of business consultants Eurasian Nexus Partners. From Washington, D.C., is a former diplomat, Ilan Goldenberg, director of the Middle East Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. And France 24's very own Sanam Chantier is with us as well. They're back at the bargaining table after 3 years of those heightened sanctions. What has that meant for ordinary Iranians? It's a France 24 report by correspondent Reza Sayeh.
When spring arrives in Iran, so does the celebration of the Iranian New Year. But what's hidden here, beneath the splendor of spring, is stress and hardship. Fruit stand owner Behzad Mousavi says earning an income has never been harder.
بدترین سال بود فکر کنم. نه برای من، برای اکثر مردم بدترین سال سختی بود ولی
Vahid and his wife say the cost of raising two girls has never been so high.
حالا من چقدر کار میکنم صبح از تاریکی میرم تا شب تاریکی میام چیزی نتونستم مثلا اضافه کنم چیزی.
The economic pain here is due in part to the U.S. maximum pressure campaign and sanctions, still choking an economy already hampered by corruption and mismanagement.
خیلی فشار زیادی به مردم آورد ولی به نظرم نتیجه‌ای فکر نکنم اونا گرفته باشن.
The aim of the U.S. maximum pressure campaign was to rein in what Washington calls Iran's destabilizing behavior in the region and curb its missile program. But today, Iran still funds and trains proxy forces in the region, continues to expand its ballistic missile program, and build up its nuclear program. In its latest report, the UN's nuclear watchdog said Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium is roughly 15 times more than the limit set in the 2015 nuclear deal. Conservative Iranian lawmaker Abul Fazl Amoui says other than making life painful for ordinary Iranians, the U.S. maximum pressure campaign has done little else.
Maximum pressure campaign was not fruitful because it didn't bring Iranian to the knees. But one of the highest inflation in our economy have happened during this campaign. We can see that Iranian people have many different problems toward our economy.
Iranians are eager to see the outcome of talks aimed at restoring the nuclear deal and lifting U.S. sanctions. Until then, Iran's economic pain persists, and a nuclear deal with global implications hangs in the balance.
Bijan Kajapur, as we head towards those June elections, what do Iranians want?
I think the biggest pain point is definitely the economy. The Iranian people definitely want better economic conditions. They obviously also would be happy about more social freedoms and more moderation in the domestic atmosphere. But the real pain point is the economy. As your reporter reported, it has been a very tough period, two years of what the economists call stagflation, so stagnation and high inflation. But the good news is that the economy is turning around, and this is part of the story in Iran, that the Iranians as a whole have a culture of adapting to new situations. So this year, actually, the Iranian economy will return to modest growth. It's not enough growth to really make up for the losses of the past 3 years, but it shows that there is a certain degree of adaptation economically and also domestically. But the reality is that Iran, on all levels, economic levels, social levels, scientific levels, is well below its actual potential. And the Iranian society would like to get back to a position where it can achieve its actual potential on all these different fields.
And this brings us back to the point Sanam was making just before the break. 10 days ago, we saw China's foreign minister in Tehran to sign what was billed as a partnership deal worth an alleged $400 billion. Sanam, you were saying you're skeptical, though, when you look at...
Not at all skeptical. It's not about that. Just for me, this doesn't represent anything that's necessarily breakthrough, Francois, because as I mentioned earlier before we went into break, this is a decades-long allegiance that we're speaking about. I think the reason that we're seeing something like that, potentially, and I'm sure the panelists will comment on that, is because Iran at the moment is in the process, because of this lack of trust, because of what it feels like a letdown from the US side. It's amassing bargaining chips. Is this deal one of them? Is also the detention of nationals from the UK, from France, from Germany, who are party to these talks as part of that. Iran...
Just to remind our viewers on that point, they tried to build this mechanism where they could do transactions that weren't in US dollars so they wouldn't be sanctioned.
They call it
but the
diplomacy.
Europeans failed to do it.
And it hasn't come through successfully.
So would ordinary Iranians prefer to do more business with China in that regard then?
I think quite potentially. As I said, I think the details of the deal have not been made public, and that's why there was so much pushback from inside Iran, from ordinary Iranians themselves, even though some of the information was leaked online last year, if I'm not mistaken, Francois. But the bigger issue at hand here is some outside players, certainly the critics, are saying Iran is being stubborn in the way it's been dealing with this. From the Iranian perspective, beyond even the framework of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, they felt that Washington has not given them any concessions, whether it's to do, and we saw in that report, the economy has been in tatters, even though, as Bijan said, it's starting to look up. the Iranians feel that no concessions have been made when it comes to humanitarian transactions, and even the fact that an IMF loan that Iran asked, certainly in light of this global health crisis, this pandemic, something that's potentially blocked by the US, they feel that they've been let down on all fronts. And I think this is something you'll hear echoed time and time again. There is a massive issue of trust when it comes to the negotiators, as well as people inside Iran, disenchanted, disbelieving even in this diplomatic process that we're seeing unravel in Vienna today.
So, Ilan Goldenberg, there's consensus on the panel that sanctions don't work, just like they didn't work for the likes of Cuba and Venezuela. But the question is then, what is the Biden administration's next step? Will there be sweeteners? Will there be the blocking of that request for an IMF loan? What do you do if you're the Biden administration at this point when it's only the beginning and you're nowhere near a deal?
Sure. Well, look, I mean, I think at least my view is not the sanctions don't work. It's the sanctions by themselves don't work if they're not part of a strategy, right? And so, like, I think what worked in the past was both an application of economic pressure, but also a willingness to negotiate and provide positive incentives. And so I think this is exactly the situation the Biden administration faces now. And as the negotiations have begun, what they're talking about is some kind of an agreement that allows them two kind of agreements. One that allows Iran to come back into compliance with its nuclear obligations. Two is an agreement that allows the U.S. to come back into compliance with its sanctions relief obligations. And I think what they've talked about is some kind of a roadmap that both sides can agree to at the beginning for how this all goes through and how it ends. And then different sides are taking different steps at different moments of that. Some have called that a step-by-step. The Iranians are now saying, well, we don't want step-by-step. We want to see the whole thing. And so, but I think you can have a whole map and a whole plan and that has a series of different steps along the way, as long as you agree to the whole thing at once. It's kind of my sense of where they're trying to go. And my hope is that would include some upfront stuff from the U.S., especially on humanitarian, medical, COVID-19 relief, which I would like to see the U.S. do quickly, but also then additional steps by the U.S. in exchange for additional steps by Iran, and eventually we're back in compliance.
And what matters more from a U.S. perspective? Is it the upcoming elections, or is it that deal that was announced with China at the end of last month?
I mean, I think what matters most for the United States right now is getting back in both sides into the nuclear agreement and putting Iran's nuclear program in a box. So it's really not either of those other two issues. I mean, the elections are a factor, but as I've said before, the American administration is going to negotiate with whoever is on the other side. As for the agreement with China, I tend to agree that this isn't some kind of a major shift. It's been a long process. There's been a long debate inside of Iran, like, should we be engaging with the Chinese, the Russians, the U.S., Europe? Like, how do we do this? And look, they all have, the U.S. and Europe have, I think a lot of Iranians will now say, are unreliable given the last few years. On the other hand, their experiences with China have also not always been great. Especially when it comes to under sanctions, where Chinese goods, the Iranians oftentimes get low-end Chinese goods sold to them at a high price because they're under pressure and had no other choices but to deal with China. So there's not necessarily like a love for Chinese goods inside of Iran, and Bijan can talk to that more than I can. But these are the choices Iran faces geostrategically, and it's going to try to balance between all the actors and try to find what's the best pathway for it based on what it thinks it can do most reliably.
Bijan Kajipur, do Iranians look east or west?
I want to say one thing about the Iran-China framework agreement, because there was, you mentioned a figure of $400 billion of investments, which is not true. The agreement does not have any reference to actual investments or figures. It refers to the potential of signing future agreements within different sectors.
So it's a wish list.
And those like, it's a wish list, it's a framework, it's a desire to use the synergies between the two countries, between the markets. Now, I think the main message from the Iranian side is Iran doesn't want to be isolated. This is important. when these whole sort of maximum pressure started in 2018, and Elon knows that very well, there were people in Washington who were saying, oh, Iran will be either another North Korea or another Venezuela. Well, I can tell you 3 years later, Iran is Iran. It's not going to be a North Korea because it doesn't want to be isolated. And it's not going to be Venezuela because it's a lot more resourceful and a lot more creative in finding solutions to push back against sanctions, to survive, not necessarily to thrive, but to survive. Now, the problem is Iran wants to thrive. Iran wants to be, and it's a stated objective of the Islamic Republic, to be the number one technological and economic power of the region. You can't be the number one technological and economic power of the region if you just grow 1 or 2% a year. You can't even create enough jobs for your own society. So you need to grow 8%, 9%, 10%, and that will only happen if there is significant foreign investment and technological transfer to Iran. And that's what Iran wants. And Iran is saying loudly, Europeans, Americans, if you don't give us what we need to become that technological power in this region, then we have no choice but to look elsewhere. And there is actually a very good, in fact, the current Foreign Minister, Jawad Zarif, has written about these issues, that Iran needs to have good relations with all the powers in the world, focusing on immediate neighbors, but...
So I was going to ask you, Bijan Kajapur, on that score, you're sitting in Vienna. Where does this leave Europe? I'm thinking, for instance, about French oil giant Total. It's had to suspend work on the area where there's maybe the world's largest natural gas reserve, the South Pars gas field. It can't go back and do business there. Where does it leave Europe, not just for these high-end projects like that, but even for small and medium-sized European companies that want to do business in Iran?
Well, I have to tell you that the Europeans lost a lot of credibility because of what happened after the US withdrawal from the JCPOA. Sitting in Europe, I fully understand the position of the European companies. It was a very clear calculation. They were not prepared to give up the opportunities in the US market or US financial sector because of the Iranian market. But there is a credibility deficit on behalf of the Europeans. This doesn't mean the end of the sort of European opportunities in Iran, but it means that they have to come in assuming that Iran and the US will go back to full compliance and most of the sanctions will be lifted. European companies will have to show their new attitude and their new understanding for the Iranian market. In these 6 years, Iranian companies have developed. It's true, it's still not the number one, economic and technological power in the region, but it has the potential to be. And it has developed domestic capacities that will come to fore when the sanctions are lifted. So what's important is that the Europeans sort of restore the credibility they had in the 2000s because they were there despite American sanctions. This is the difference between 1998, when Bill Clinton introduced a number of sanctions against Iran, and 2007, 2008, Europeans were there despite US sanctions and their governments were supporting them. This time, the Europeans withdrew because of the fear of sanctions from the US, and they lost credibility. But there are opportunities. I think it's important to understand the different economic, social, and cultural and political realities in Iran. But one has to go back with a new understanding and a new attitude towards the Iranian market.
Ilan Goldenberg, we heard Bijan spell it out very well there. Over the last 2 decades, this weaponization of the US dollar, not just when it comes to Iran, but things like violations of sanctions on Sudan, and for instance, where French companies got, French banks, in fact, got huge fines as a result of it. Does it mean when you enter talks like the ones we're entering, even if they're indirect, it is the US now calling the shots? It isn't, even though I know there are the other members of the Security Council in Germany in this JCPOA format, it's all about the U.S. and Iran?
Well, I mean, I think it's always been all about the U.S. and Iran, with or without, the economic issues. This is fundamentally, that's what the JCPOA was all about. And that's what a lot of these disagreements, this security competition in the region, right? Which ultimately for Iran is based on the threat it sees from the United States going back to 1979, and the experience, and before that, and the experience that the U.S. has had with Iran going back to the hostage crisis. And so that is still at the core of this entire story, and I think will remain so. Doesn't mean Europe doesn't matter, doesn't mean China doesn't matter and Russia doesn't matter. They're also important players, and the JCPOA would never have been possible without this broader international support. But at the end of the day, the hardest conversations and the most important conversations have to happen between the U.S. and Iran, which is also why, the one thing that worries me about this current format, I think it's great that they're talking, but I really hope that soon we get to the point where you can have direct U.S.-Iran negotiations, because that is where the most important dialogue ultimately happens. And I think all the parties recognize that. On the economic front, I will say one thing there too, which is just that, yes, the U.S., I think there's been sort of a falling in love with sanctions as a tool. I do think Donald Trump demonstrated, there's a lot of question before Donald Trump, right, about whether or not you needed full international support to apply economic pressure. And the answer is you don't. Trump has kind of demonstrated that you can bully the rest of the world into applying economic pressure. But he also didn't get any concessions out of Iran because he wasn't able to sort of couple that economic pressure with broad international support or a credible way out for the Iranians that they saw as viable. And so you need all those things. But there is a danger for the U.S. if it falls too much in love with sanctions and too much in love with economic use of power this way unilaterally, that countries look for alternatives over time, including our allies and partners. Europe, I think, is going to walk out of this experience the last few years thinking we need a more independent economic foreign policy. We need a way to be able to not be put in a situation where we have to go along with the Americans because our companies and our corporations won't do anything different, even if we have different national security interests. Now, whether Europe can actually credibly build that alternative is an entirely different question. But I know that there's been a lot of frustration in Europe about the way this has all gone over the past few years.
Sanam Shanti?
There has been a great deal of frustration. We've even had our own very Emmanuel Macron at a time when he's trying to carve himself a position when it comes to the global stage, being very vocal, at times in support of the JCPOA, other times trying to push beyond the remits of the deal, saying that Iran's missiles program, its regional activities should also be part of this. That is not the case. Ultimately, we're back at the table, albeit indirect negotiations, and it looks like the calls are being shot by the Americans and the Iranians.
Things have gone fast. Could we have more pleasant
surprises? You're really stuck on this going fast, aren't you? I'm not going to go down this path.
You're not going to go there? You didn't bring a crystal ball.
I will stick with cautious optimism, François Picard. It's been too long.
All right. Hedging her bets. Sanam Chantier. Many thanks for that. I want to thank as well Bijan Kajapur for being with us from Vienna. Ilan Goldenberg in Washington. We want to thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.